Our gospel reading for today contains what might just be the most famous and well-known Bible verse ever, John 3:16. You've all seen it held up on signs at sporting events. If you've ever driven through rural areas of the Midwest or the South, you've seen it on billboards alongside the road. If you like country music, you've heard it quoted many times. Most memorably for me is in Keith Urban's song, John Cougar, John Deere, John 3:16. Where he talks about how everything he needed to learn, he learned from the lyrics of John Cougar Mellencamp while riding a John Deere tractor or from John's Gospel. I thought about just playing that song as my sermon, but I know that not everyone's a fan of country and there's not really much theology there. So, as I read the text for today in preparation for this sermon, it was not our beloved verse 16 that caught my eye. No, it was the very first verse of the passage. And just as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, so must the Son of Man be lifted up. This is a reference to the first reading that we heard from Numbers. Now, there's a big part of me that would love to dig into this more than a little problematic story about God sending snakes as punishment, but again, that's not what caught my eye. One word stuck out, echoed over and over again in my head, must. So must the Son of Man. And immediately I was transported back to my first year of seminary. There's a special place in heaven for professors that teach students in their first year of seminary. We come in full of profound questions that no one has ever thought of before, and insights that are absolutely unique and unparalleled, just like every other class of first-year seminary students. And these professors, they have to graciously and gently inform us that they have indeed heard and thought about all of those questions before. Actually, I really liked my Old Testament professor. He would just straight up tell us that our interpretations were wrong. But I digress. The time that our reading for today made me think of happened during our Introduction to the Gospels class, where we asked the big question, did Jesus have to die? What would have happened if he hadn't? Would our sins still be forgiven? Would the powers of death have been defeated all the same? It certainly seemed like a profound idea to us. We find ourselves in the fourth Sunday of Lent, more than halfway along the journey to Holy Week today. And for the past few weeks, our gospel readings have all been pointing to the inevitability of what happened on that fateful Friday so many years before we called it good. 2 weeks ago, Jesus told the disciples that he must undergo great suffering and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes and be killed. Last week, he told all who witnessed him turning over the tables of the money changers that they should destroy this temple and in 3 days he would raise it up. He was speaking, of course, of his own death and resurrection and not the physical building. And then we have today's reading. The Son of Man must be lifted up. In all of these, he presents his fate as inescapable. It is going to happen. It needs to happen. It must happen. But why? Well, that question gets us into some seriously deep theological waters. The official term is atonement theology, and it delves into what happened when Jesus died on the cross, why it happened the way it did, and what happened as a result. And there are many different theories of atonement, and as someone who loves to ask those big why questions, I find them fascinating. Some of them say that Jesus, in his blameless and sinless state, took the punishment that humanity should have borne for our sinfulness. Others say that all of humanity's sins were put on Jesus in that moment, and they died with him on the cross. And still others say that the true point wasn't his death, but it was the resurrection, the fact that even death couldn't defeat God. And there are many, many more. The problem when it comes to religion, and actually when it comes to any of these big why questions, is that rarely is there ever one that is absolutely true and correct. They all make sense to varying degrees, but there's no way of knowing 100% without a doubt. That's why we call them theories. If you're interested in learning more about this, please let me know. I've been itching to do an adult ed series on this, but I know just because it's interesting to me doesn't mean it's interesting to everybody. But anyway, the answer that our professor gave us in that intro to the Gospels class has stuck with me ever since. He skirted the questions about what would have happened if he hadn't died, and he didn't answer any of the questions about sin or punishment. What he said was that Jesus was always going to die because of how he lived. Jesus lived in a way that was fundamentally incompatible, incongruous with the way that the world worked, and in many ways with the way that the world still works. Jesus chose to focus on outsiders, the broken, the sick, the people that had been pushed to the margins of society. He came preaching messages of forgiveness and mercy. He offered healing free of charge. He showed us that power can manifest itself in things other than force and domination, that true power expresses itself in humility, service, and love. Love really is the word that sums it all up. Jesus lived a life defined by love. For God so loved the world that God sent Jesus, God's only Son, into this world to live out that love. To live out that love in the midst of a people who loved darkness more than light. To live a life ruled by love in the midst of a world ruled by power, by money, by fear, by might makes right thinking. There was no way that the people in power at that time could allow Jesus to live, because his message of living a life grounded in love upended everything that they had ever sought to create. It would undo all of the ways that they knew how to get and maintain power. It would turn everything upside down. It has now been 1 year since all of our lives were turned upside down in a very different way. Today is March 14th. The last worship service that we held within the walls of this sanctuary was March 15th. Since then, 29 million cases have been reported in the U.S., and over 529,000 people have died as a result. Around the world, at least 118 million people have been infected, and 2.6 million have died. So much has changed. The world looks very different than it did a year ago. And I find myself with more questions than answers. What could have been done differently? How could we let something as simple as wearing a piece of cloth over our faces divide us in such bitter and unbridgeable ways? Why is it that we praised our essential workers as heroes, our teachers, grocery store and food service workers, delivery drivers, but haven't prioritized them as much as we should have when it comes to getting the vaccine? Why did the virus so disproportionately affect poor communities and communities of color? Why do some people experience no symptoms at all and others end up hospitalized? Why did this happen? And I mean beyond the science of it all, beyond the contagion models and the microbiology principles. Why did this happen? Did God cause this? Is this punishment for something that we did or didn't do? Couldn't God have done something to prevent all of the loss and grief and pain that this last year has held? And I feel angry, and I feel weary. And I don't know what to do with the anger that I feel, and I can't seem to make a dent in that weariness. Perhaps you have felt the same way, asked yourselves the same questions. Actually, there's no need for that perhaps, because I know that many of you feel this way and have asked yourself the same questions. And underneath all of those questions, or perhaps within, is that singular yet all-encompassing, maddeningly elusive, feel-it-in-your-chest question of why. Grief often makes us ask these big why questions. And we think that if we can just figure out an answer, it'll solve our grief. That yearning to find answers is also the thing that has inspired everyone, from the smartest, most inquisitive philosophers all the way down to first-year seminary students. As humans, we are programmed to try and make sense out of things, to connect the dots, to figure out cause and effect, recognize patterns, to make meaning in the world around us. But we find that oftentimes the biggest questions in life don't have answers, or at least answers that completely satisfy us. And if I'm being honest, I absolutely hate that. I want those answers so bad, and I hate it when the answer is that there is no answer. But regardless of whether or not I like it, it is true. And that's because embedded in that why is more than a simple search for information or an explanation. Embedded in that why is a protest, an objection, a desire for things to be different, even if we don't exactly know how. Embedded in that why is a desire for some sense of certainty, of control, in the hopes that we won't feel so scared anymore, won't feel so helpless or sad or angry or numb. And as always, when it comes to God, the answer that we get back is rarely the one that we expect. We can channel our inner Job and shout our questions into the mighty whirlwind all we want, but that doesn't mean we are going to get the answer that we want, or even one that entirely makes sense. In response to our great and guttural, heartbroken and tear-filled cry of why, we get a single word in response, the same one that was given to me by my Gospels professor: love. For God so loved the world. Those words are a promise that every single action of God, every single way that God relates to this world, relates to you and to me, is grounded in, saturated with, overflowing with love. God sees and hears and feels the suffering of this world and responds to our cries with love that culminated in the act of sending Jesus into this world. God sent Jesus into this world of pain and suffering not to give us easy answers about the source or cause of those aspects of our existence, and certainly not to take all of them away and provide us a life free of hardship and strife. God sent Jesus into this world so that we might know that we are not alone, to know that we are loved beyond our wildest dreams, to show us that God's chosen, preferred, always and forever way of interacting with us and all of creation is through love. So much so that Jesus would rather experience a horrible and brutal death on the cross than abandon that commitment to living in love. It is love that holds us close, a love that gathers us into God's embrace and helps us to loosen our clenched fists, relax our death grip on those questions that we thought were so important, on figuring out those answers that we thought would fix everything. And almost always that is exactly what I need, because I find myself getting stuck in that place of obsessing over the why of things far more than I would care to admit. Getting fixated on the questions and being oh so certain that there's some answer out there that will satisfy and resolve everything that I'm feeling. I know I'm not alone in this. And God interrupts that cycle, lifts us up out of the mud when all we are doing is spinning our wheels, and reminds us that we are loved. And from the security of that love, we can begin to ask different questions. And that's not to say that those questions of why aren't important. All I'm saying is that at a certain point, we have to shift from asking why to asking, so what am I going to do about it? And who better to emulate when it comes to figuring out how we should respond to a broken and hurting world than God? And no, I don't mean that we should set a whole bunch of snakes loose until people start acting right, as tempting as that might be. Love begets love begets love. For God so loved the world that God sent Jesus into it to remind us that no matter what we experience, we are never alone. To show us how to live in love in the midst of a world that so often prefers darkness to light. To teach us that while we may never find truly satisfactory answers to the questions of why, that fact shouldn't stop us from asking it all the same. And to remind us that we will always know the answer to at least one question. The question, how should I respond? Amen.